All right, we are at Harmony 79, our 79th episode going through the life of Jesus. We're going to be reading today from Matthew 21, John 12, Mark 11, and Luke 19. All four of the Gospels contain the following story, and if you read them, there's a little bit of difference in how they lay it out, but they're all going to be making the same point. So before we get into the story, we need to talk about figs and fig trees, because this is what you want to hear about on a Sunday morning when you come to church. I'm going to read you a couple passages from the Old Testament. Micah chapter 7, verses 1 through 2. This is Micah representing the thoughts of God. How miserable I am. I feel like the fruit picker after the harvest who can find nothing to eat. Not a cluster of grapes or a single early fig can be found to satisfy my hunger. The godly people have all disappeared. Not one honest person is left on earth. They are all murderers, setting traps even for their own brothers. So notice in this kind of analogy, the godly people are compared to early figs and clusters of grapes. In Hosea 9, we read, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness, and I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time. But they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves unto that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. So their fathers are compared to what's called like the early, like figs that are giving you a teaser trailer of the harvest that's to come. In Joel chapter 1, beginning of verse 6, for a nation is come up upon my land, strong and without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a lion, the teeth of a great lion. And he has laid my vine Judah waste, and he has barked my fig tree. That raises some kind of funny images in my head about barking a fig tree, but I think the idea is that it's just stripped it of all its bark and it's going to die. And then finally, this will be a key one, Proverbs 27:18. The one who guards a fig tree will eat its fruit, and whoever protects their master or their lord will be honored. A real clear analogy here, thinking of those who are in a leadership position as being a fig tree. So, fig trees used throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes it's God's people. Often it's the leaders of God's people. And then an image that goes on is when you've got lots of figs, you're doing well. You're flourishing. And when you lack figs, you're doing quite poorly, and it's kind of a symbol of judgment. This will bring us to the episode in Jesus' life today where Jesus, he does what's recorded as a miracle of destruction. It's the only one the Gospels record Jesus doing because he's going to curse a fig tree and it's going to wither. And if you're like me, it's always a little jarring when I read the account because we've been talking about just how gracious and loving Jesus is. And it sure looks like he's walking down the road and he goes to get a fig tree and he doesn't get figs. And if it were me and I did this, I'd think, boy, I'm feeling petty. Maybe I'm hangry. I really needed that fig. There's something kind of shocking about the story. Like, what is happening? He didn't get figs and lost his temper? Well, this story of the fig tree, you're going to read like a part 1 and a part 2, and it's going to wrap around an incident in the temple. And those two things are going to tell us the same story. So as we read through this example from the life of Jesus, I'll make a comment or two, and then we'll try to tie it all together and then apply it to us today. As Jesus entered Jerusalem, this is now into the last week of Jesus. They already did the triumphal entry. As Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was thrown into an uproar, saying, who is this? And the crowds were saying, oh, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. So the crowd who had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead were continuing to testify about it. Because they had heard that Jesus had performed this miraculous sign, the crowd went out to meet him. And thus the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you can do nothing. Look, the world has run off after him. And then Jesus went to the temple. And after looking around at everything, he went out to Bethany with the 12 since it was already late. Now early in the morning, the next day, as they went out from Bethany and returned to the city, Jesus was hungry. After noticing in the distance by the road a fig tree with leaves, he went to see if he could find any fruit on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, May no one ever eat fruit from you again. Never again will there be fruit from you. And his disciples heard it. So just to clarify something, as I've been reading on this, apparently that kind of fig tree, if it's got leaves, there should be fruit. And before the harvest season, there's this first fruit that was mentioned earlier, or the first ripe in Hosea 9, where once again, it's like a little teaser trailer. There's a couple figs, and if you find them before the time for harvest, you know you're going to have a good harvest. If you don't find them, there is not going to be a harvest coming. So it's not that Jesus would have expected to find 0 figs at all. What he found was that this fig tree looked like it was going to bear fruit and was not going to bear fruit at all. Let's keep going. Then they came to Jerusalem. Jesus entered the temple area and began to drive out those who were selling and buying in the temple courts. Do you remember a similar incident before in the life of Jesus? Right at the beginning of his ministry, it's one of the first things he did. He turned over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Then Jesus began to teach them and said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have turned it into a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple courts, and he healed them. By the way, pick up notes. There's so many footnotes to go with this, I just don't have time to get into. Jesus is tapping into so many things in the Old Testament about what the Messiah would be like, but I'll let you read that on your own. But when the chief priests and the experts of the law, which would be the Sadducees, saw the wonderful things he did and heard the children crying out in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became indignant and said to him, "Do you hear what they're saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yeah. Have you never read, 'Out of the mouths of children and nursing infants, you have prepared praise for yourself'?" And the chief priests and the experts in the law heard it, and they considered how they could assassinate him. Why would this make them want to assassinate him? Because they know he's claiming, "I'm God." That's why they're worshiping me and praising me. And they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed by his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. And in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered to the roots." And when the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did it wither so quickly?" And Jesus said to them, "Have faith in God. I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' and you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will happen, it will be done for you. And for this reason, I tell you, whatever you pray and ask for, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." All right, there's lots of ways people approach this passage. This morning's approach is mine. And if you find other ways that people are pulling things from this passage and it's good and true, awesome. But here's what we've got today. Let's talk about the temple and the Sadducees as being the fig trees of Israel. So when Jesus gets into Israel, it's for Passover. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people would flood the city. And there had been problems before, so you had Roman guards like stationed on top of walls all around the temple. I mean, it was a volatile time because this was a time when a lot of kind of national fervor was percolating in the Jewish people. And they're itching to be free because Rome is front and center everywhere they go, keeping their boot on them, so to speak. So they're coming to Jerusalem. It's tense. They're coming to celebrate Passover, and they run into the Sadducees. And here was the problem. We talked about this a couple months ago, but brief refresher. The Sadducees come into power when they go to Herod and say, "We will call you the king of the Jews if you give Rome your money so that we're safe." And Herod said, "Sure, I'll do that." But in exchange, he controlled the Sadducees. He appointed the high priest. So the priests no longer descended from Zadok like the Old Testament had said they should. Now the empire was selecting the high priest. This is going to lead to corruption and bribery. Those few wealthy families rising to the top with their own temple guard that was their thug group to get people to do what they wanted. And here's what was happening. The Sadducees raised the animals for sacrifice. The Sadducees sold those animals. The Sadducees changed the money, and it was a huge money grift. They just made money hand over fist, and they did it in a part of the temple where the Gentiles were allowed to come in and worship. It seems that Jesus cleared the courtyards twice, once at the beginning and once at the end of his ministry. And it's interesting to note, if you go back to Leviticus and read the law about how to cleanse a thing, there is only one thing that you had to do 2 cleansings for, and that was mold. And if you did a first cleansing and you came back and it was fine, awesome, you went on. Well, actually, you did a second cleansing and went on. But if it had come back, here's what would happen, and I'm reading now from Leviticus 14. If the mold has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped and the material